It's wonderful to have you join us for this webinar with Professor of Bioethics and Moral Philosopher Peter Singer. I'm Stuart Palmer, Head of Ethics Research at Australian Ethical Investment. And to begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on and to their ancient and living culture. For me in Sydney, the traditional owners are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Peter, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be here, Stuart. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to some of your investors.
Great. So I do want to give people a bit of background on your work and your influence, although for many, I think they'll be familiar with that. But I'll start just with an explanation why an investment manager like Australian Ethical, or any investment manager, why would we be so excited to talk to you about some of the most important practical ethical decisions we face. Australian Ethical was founded 35 years ago by people who saw that by actively investing in the good and avoiding the bad, we can have a positive influence on the planet and on its inhabitants. At the time we started, and unfortunately too often still today, mainstream investment mindset is reactive, and ignores the real power that investors have to shape the future. So part of our work has been to challenge that reactive mindset, and happily the success we've had over the years, and certainly in recent years, is making that challenge harder to ignore. So that's our success as a company and a business, we think, as we've seen influencing others, but mostly it's been our success at combining strong financial returns with strong positive impacts on people, animals, and the planet. So challenging the mainstream, challenging convention, leading change is at the heart of what Peter Singer has done throughout his life. Peter is Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University. He's the author of many books which have challenged the way we think about our ethical responsibilities to other humans, and more broadly about our ethical responsibilities to all animals. His 1975 book, Animal Liberation, changed what many people eat and stopped them using many products which had been tested on animals. His book, The Expanding Circle, Ethics, Evolution and Moral Progress, helped us understand the origins and continuing development of human moral decision-making, and helped us apply reason to expand the circle of people and other sentient creatures whose well-being we value and who we see we have a responsibility to protect. More recently, Peter has focused on effective altruism with books that make all too clear why we should all be doing more to improve the lives of people living in extreme poverty. There are a lot of philosophy books on my bookshelves which I haven't read, but they're not Peter's. Peter's writing is very accessible, and alongside his deep thinking, his books are full of practical calls to action and practical tools for people who want to live a better life. And Peter's not content simply to lead change with his book writing or with his teaching. He was a co-founder of Australia's leading animal advocacy organisation, Animals Australia, and the founder of The Life You Can Save, which works globally to inspire and empower people to combat poverty. But we're going to be hearing more about that from Peter shortly. Another Australian philosopher, Peter Godfrey Smith, calls Peter the most influential and controversial philosopher in the world today. He says Peter has had more effect on what people actually do than any other philosopher for many years. And I think that's an amazing credential, and why we're so fortunate to be joined by Peter today. So the discussion with Peter will be divided into three topics: effective altruism, climate change and animal welfare. Peter's going to speak for about 10 minutes on a topic, then we'll have Q&A on that topic. So please, as we're talking, enter your questions into the Q&A section. After the first topic, we're also going to hear briefly from the head of our Australian Ethical Foundation, Nick Chadwick. So Peter, let's get into it. Over 10 years ago, in your book, The Life You Can Save, you made the very compelling case that if we are in a position to radically improve the well-being of others at minimal cost to ourselves, then we should do it. And that we should be doing it as effectively as we can. Can you tell us about this and whether people have taken up your challenge?
Thanks very much, Stuart. It's great to be here and to be able to talk to some of your investors. as you say, I first published The Life You Can Save in 2009, and I updated it for a 10th anniversary edition last year. The book, I think, should be seen as part of a growing recent movement known as effective altruism. For those not familiar with that term, you will be familiar with the term altruism, of course. So altruists are people who make it their aim, not necessarily their sole aim, of course, but one of their aims to do good to others, if you like, to make the world a better place for all of those in it. And that's been around for quite a while. But one thing that altruists have not focused enough on is trying to use whatever resources they put into making the world a better place as effectively as possible. And in a sense, that's curious because in many other ways, we do try to do things as effectively to maximize our resources. So if we need to buy a new laptop or phone or car, most of us will do some research into what is going to be the one that gives us best value for our money. And if we bought something and showed it to somebody and they said, you paid that much for it, you could have got it for half the price, we're probably going to feel a bit stupid. We didn't get good value for our money. But when people give to charity, they don't make those comparisons. Nobody would ever say to you, you could have got twice the value for your dollars, done twice as much good by giving to this other charity. Of course, occasionally people will say that charity is just a fraud, you shouldn't give to it. But that's very rare, or at least it's rare that it's true that the charity is a fraud. All of the well-known named charities do some good. But it's surprising how much difference there is in how much good they do for your dollar. And whereas it would be unusual to get a laptop, let's say, at half the price that someone else pays, it's not at all unusual to do twice as much good for one charity to do twice as much good as another, or 10 times as much good, or 100 times as much good or more. And let me just give you an example of that. So one charity that does good is charities that train guide dogs for people who are visually impaired. If you've flown through airports, probably not recently, but if you have, you might have seen these big plastic dogs with a slot that you can drop your coins into. So that's a good thing to do, right? It's good that somebody who is visually impaired can have a well-trained dog and work with that dog to help them get around. Yes, it is good, but it's quite expensive. Costs, let's say, around $40,000 to train a guide dog to work with a visually impaired person and to train the person to work with the guide dog. Compare that with the cost of restoring sight in somebody who is blind or preventing someone going blind. Restoring sight might be something that can be done by removing cataracts from people in countries where they're too poor and there's no national health service. So otherwise they just go blind if they have serious cataracts, which doesn't, of course, happen here because you can get it done on the health service. Or preventing people going blindness from trachoma, which is a leading cause of preventable blindness and can quite easily be prevented. It's something that it's a microorganism that gets into people's eyes in hot, dusty climates where hygiene is not great. So that costs, if you look at Fred Hollows, you might have seen their advertising. They do some of these things. They say for $25, you can restore someone's sight. Let's say that that's not always the case, that's, naturally they would go for the lowest possible estimate. Let's say it costs $100 to restore someone's sight. Well, compare $100 to restore someone's sight with $40,000 to give somebody who's visually impaired a guide dog. It seems to me clearly better to restore someone's sight than to give them a guide dog. So it's at least 400 times better value to do that, to restore someone's sight who's blind, than to train a guide dog. That's what I mean by saying that there are huge multiples, even among totally bona fide charities that are doing good. And a lot of people don't know about that. The effective altruism movement is trying to promote greater knowledge of that, so that people can find out about that, so that they can go online to websites like thelifeyoucansave.org, the organization I founded, or givewell.org, another organization that does research on the impact of charities helping people in extreme poverty. And you can find the most effective charities. So that's the effective part of effective altruism. And you can see how important that is. Of course, it's good to encourage more people to be altruistic, to think about helping others, to think about what they can do for people who are much less fortunate than pretty much everybody in Australia is, really, in terms of having basic services like health service and clean water. It's good to get people to do more, but it's equally important to get people to think about where they're donating so that they can do more good. And that's the message of the book, The Life You Can Save, and of the organization itself. It's trying to encourage people to do more, and it's trying to encourage them to do it more effectively. Stuart, you asked me sort of how is that going in terms of more people doing it? Well, the movement is certainly growing. It's only about a dozen years old. In fact, one of the key organizations that was started in 2008 in Oxford was by another Australian philosopher, one much younger than me, called Toby Ord, who set up an organization called Giving What We Can. He was a graduate student in Oxford at the time. Giving What We Can asks people to pledge to give at least 10% of their income now and throughout their career to the best charities they can find. Already members of Giving What We Can, I think there've been about 5,000 who've taken that pledge, have given close to $200 million in terms of their income. Maybe it's 200 million pounds actually, as it's a UK organization. And in terms of their pledges, if we expect them to follow a normal career path and keep to it, we're talking about getting around a couple of $1 billion that will be given. And there are a number of other organizations that are doing this, including some very wealthy people who've been persuaded by this message. A good example of that is Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna. Dustin Moskovitz was a co-founder of Facebook, made a lot of money there, now heads up Asana. So Dustin and his wife Carrie are billionaires. They have a foundation called Good Ventures, and they're trying to work out the best ways to give away. I think there's something like $8 billion in that foundation. So they're involved in effective altruism. They've got an organization called Open Philanthropy that's looking at a variety of different effective philanthropic causes. So I think the movement is successful. Of course, I'd like it to be more successful and to become more mainstream because even when you get extremely wealthy givers giving, it's still not as much as if you got pretty much everybody giving some of what they're doing for effective altruism. I'm in the United States, for example, I think the total amount given to charity is around 450 billion, but only 6% of that is given to places outside the United States, and yet that's clearly where the greatest need is. So we really need to get more people thinking about this on a global scale. You can see on your screen now where you can get the podcast of the audiobook, The Life You Can Save. You can now get it on Spotify. You can also go to thelifeyoucansave.org.au and you get the podcast, which each chapter is a separate podcast. Or if you prefer to read an ebook, you can get it as an ebook. So as I say, this is a relatively young movement, but I think it's growing and I think it's doing good. The Life You Can Save in particular is quite a small organization, but we are directing significant funds to the most effective charities. And I just was part of a board meeting. For everything we spend on ourselves, we're giving about $13. For every $1 we spend on ourselves, we're getting about $13 flowing to the most effective charities. So we think we're good value, and we hope people will support The Life You Can Save, as well as the charities that you can find recommended on its website. Thanks very much, Stuart. I'll be happy to take some questions and comments.
Yep. So just to remind people, the Q&A button there, please enter your questions for Peter there. And while we're waiting for those to come in and be processed, one from me, Peter. You sort of talk about this idea in the book about, you know, the merit of giving anonymously, or the idea that we give anonymously because we're doing it for the intrinsic good of giving rather than reputational reasons. But you talk about the challenge, the danger of that doesn't necessarily build a culture of giving, and having prominent people give is actually a powerful influence on others. And yeah, it just occurred to me as you were talking about sort of that we're seeing some of those more prominent people give. Is there something else that needs to happen alongside that to get less wealthy people to make it part of their day-to-day, and channels for them to, I guess, publicize that to encourage others to do it?
Right. Yes. I mean, people are naturally a bit reticent. You know, you don't want to boast about being better than others. You don't want to come across as being sort of self-righteous. But there is good psychological research showing that people are more likely to help when they see others are helping, and they're more likely to give when they know that others are giving. So that's why we're encouraging people not to be shy, but to talk about giving as an important part of their life. And you know, for many people, it is a very fulfilling part of their life. It's something that actually means something to them. It gives more meaning to their life to know that they are able to help other people, particularly for those who have more money than they need to live on and meet their needs and the needs of those who are close to them. It makes that more meaningful to have accumulated wealth if there's then something very good, very important that you can do with that wealth. So I think, you know, we do pay attention to the psychology of giving, and that suggests people talking about it will help to create more of a culture of giving in which that comes to be seen as just part of a normal life of living ethically.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple have come in, taking two together. The difficulty in identifying the best charity is knowing what they really do. What sort of research do you do into the charities that you recommend? And another question, how can someone put forward a charity for you folks to consider for inclusion on the website?
Great. So those questions are related. It does take a lot of research to find out what a charity is actually doing and what kind of value it's giving you for your dollars. And a lot of that research, the leading organization is one called GiveWell, which you can find online at givewell.org, set up by a couple of young American hedge fund analysts who were making a lot of money and wanted to give some away, and essentially couldn't find out what the charities would do with their money. They would ask them, and they would get sort of glossy brochures and generalities about, you know, we're helping kids get enough food, or we're helping them get clean water, or we're stopping them dying of diarrhea. But they just didn't get any facts and figures. And there's hedge fund analysts, they were nerdy types who wanted facts and figures and data. And when they realized that there's this great vacuum, two in the group left to set up givewell.org, left the hedge fund, supported by others in the hedge fund to get them going. And they now have a team of skilled researchers who are doing this work, and you can find the results of their work there. What the Life You Can Save doesn't have the capacity to do the amount of research that GiveWell does. So what we do is pool research from GiveWell and from some other, perhaps less well-known organizations like Impact Matters and Founders Pledge and others that do this research. So you don't need to do it yourself. You can look at either givewell.org or thelifeyoucansave.org and get those recommendations from that. Now, did I answer both questions then, or did I forget?
Well, so if I'm a charity and I'm doing great things,
what is it do you want to do? So really, you need to get assessed by GiveWell or Impact Matters or one of these organizations. And even though they do have a good team of researchers, the capacity is limited. There's a vast number of charities out there. They can't assess them all. If it's promising, they'll take a quick look at it and see whether it looks like it's a candidate for one of their top-ranked charities. And if it is, then they'll take a deep dive. And if you survive that, then you'll get listed as one of their recommended charities. But it's quite a small number that they're recommending. Not that the others may not be good, but that it's hard to get the evidence that they want to show that they're good. So yeah, by all means, contact them. You can contact the Life You Can Save as well if you like, and we can pass on recommendations. We'll take a look as well. But the research will have to be done by one of the other organisations.
Great. Another one. So we spend a lot of our lives working. How should we be thinking about our work and our working lives when we're thinking about doing the most good that we can do?
Well, it depends a bit on what stage of your working life you're at. If you're young and still making career choices or having the possibility of pursuing another career, there is an organization that's part of the effective altruism movement called 80,000 Hours, 80,000hours.org. 80,000 being someone's estimate of the number of hours the typical person spends in their career. So there's career advice for different people there, and that's useful, how you can have a positive impact on the world. If you're already in your career, your options may be more limited. But one thing that's encouraging for those who are in sectors where they may feel they're not the most, they're not working for a charity or something like that, but they are making significant amounts of money, is that one of the careers that is recommended by 80,000 Hours is earning to give. So it's basically maximizing your potential for earnings, hopefully in a sector that is not doing harm anyway, even if it's not doing specific good, and then using that to give to the most effective charities. And there's an argument that actually that's better than working for the charity itself, because if you think about it, suppose that there's a charity out there, they advertise for a position, you apply, you get the position, and you work for the charity, and no doubt you do some good. But if you hadn't got that job, someone else would have got it. And the good that you're really doing is only the marginal difference between you as the best applicant for the job and the second best applicant for the job. Whereas if you earn enough money to donate to the organization and enable them to set up an entirely new position, which you easily could if you're successful in various industries, then the entire good done by the extra person is due to what you've been able to earn and donate. And maybe you can even donate more than one position. So it's certainly arguable that you can do more good by donating than you could have if instead of earning a lot of money, you'd gone into one of these organizations in the non-profit sector and had worked there.
Right. What role might effective altruism have in helping shape a Build Back Better recovery from COVID-19?
So effective altruism hasn't focused very much on COVID-19. The Life You Can Save does recommend organizations which are working in low-income countries, and some of those in the present crisis have adapted to the COVID-19 situation to try to help things. For example, one of them is an organization called Development Media International, which has for a long time specialized in public health announcements on local radio in very poor countries like Burkina Faso, where that's the only means really that rural people may have to get information. They can afford radios, but they don't have any other regular means of information. So they've been doing things like basic health information for a long time. And now that COVID has come along, they're providing information about that, about making sure that you keep good hygiene, that you wash your hands if you're in contact with other people who might be spreading it, social distance, all the things that we are flooded with in Australia in terms of the media that they might not otherwise get. So effective altruism can help stop or reduce the spread of COVID through organizations like that. But in terms of building back better afterwards, I haven't seen particular proposals. So I can't really say that we're doing much. What we're hoping, of course, is that the spirit of helping people in need, which has been strong and reinforced during the pandemic, will carry on afterwards, and that it will extend also to countries that are less well off than we are. And maybe just one thing that I'll add is I think effective altruists are supporting the efforts to make sure that the vaccines, when they come online, don't only go to affluent countries. And it's been good to see the Australian federal government actually making some commitments in that regard, especially with relation to our Pacific neighbours, which of course, is in our own self-interest, but is a very good thing to be happening anyway.
Great. All right. Well, listen, I think it's time for us to move on. We can come back to some other questions if we have time later, but we're going to get to our next topic, climate change, very shortly. But before we do, I just want to introduce Nick Chadwick. He's the head of the Australian Ethical Foundation. And yeah, Nick, please tell us a little bit about the foundation and maybe about its experience with the Life You Can Save.
Sure. Thanks, Stuart, and thank you, Peter, for covering off what is such an important topic. So at Australian Ethical, every year, as per our constitution, we give 10% of our profits are donated through our Australian Ethical Foundation to charities both here in Australia and overseas. In 2020, we gave away $1.3 million to social and environmental initiatives in Australia and around the world, covering off on our core pillars of people, planet, and animals. This pool of money is obviously derived from the collective efforts of everyone involved with Australian Ethical, all our stakeholders, shareholders, employees, investors. So we're really focused on creating the most social and environmental impact possible for every dollar that we do donate. So that's a process and journey we're on, and we're always trying to improve that work. So I guess, what does that look like in practice from a corporate foundation perspective? So firstly, when we assess charities, we score them against our impact assessment framework. So that covers off a whole bunch of key criteria, but one of them is the cost effectiveness of the work that a charity is doing. So this looks to assess and rate how successful a charity is at reaching its desired targeted outcomes. So for example, saving X amount of lives or sequestering X amount of carbon. And as Peter alluded to earlier, this to do this body of research is very time intensive. So we do the best job we can, but it is a core component of how we look at charities. So we do embed those principles as best we can, given our resourcing. But secondly, and as alluded to earlier, we've been working more and more closely with the Life You Can Save to identify charities that align with our strategic impact focus areas. So we can be really confident by working with the Life You Can Save that the charities we support to choose to support will be really effective and achieve the strong positive outcomes on the issues that we're focused on and that they're also focused on. So over the last 12 to 18 months, we've now supported 3 charities via multi-year partnerships from recommended charities on the Life You Can Save, and we're really focused on educating and empowering women. So a good example of a charity that we're funding is Living Goods. They're a Ugandan healthcare charity supporting community health workers in remote communities to provide all sorts of treatment and education work. So mainly around malaria, malnutrition, and also maternal health, family planning services, and things like that. As Peter touched on earlier as well, they're doing really great work around COVID-19 and pivoting how they support communities with their outreach work already. So yeah, it's been really comforting speaking with the Life You Can Save and hearing from those charities how they've responded so quickly in a pandemic, given the pressures that a lot of charities are already under. So to date, we've donated, well, this year we donated $50,000 to the Living Goods. I'll just pull up a quick slide here, which showcases cool feature from the Life You Can Save website, which showcases what a donation does and the impact it can achieve. So our $50,000 Australian donation, which is $35,000 US, you can put what you're able to donate into on the website. But for us, here's a kind of simplified version of what our funding is going towards. So you can see there that it's an extremely effective usage of funds in terms of directly supporting people. So we've had really great relationship with the Life You Can Save, and particularly supporting women and girls. So that's our foundation's core focus, and why we focus on that is predominantly because of climate change. There's some really great and compelling research around how educating and empowering women globally is one of the most effective ways to address climate change and help control the issues that we're seeing around the world. So I think another strong link, which we've spoken about in the past, Peter and Stuart, is the effect of the disproportionate effect that climate change will have on the global poor, which I think is something that the Life You Can Save is beginning to look at as well, and other effective altruism movements, and trying to understand this, this new driver of disproportionate impact. But I believe our next topic for Peter to talk about will be climate change. So I'll throw back to Peter at this point.
And actually, Peter, before you do, because I'll just introduce climate in a sec, but there's one Life You Can Save question that came through, which I really like, so I've got to ask it. Do you distinguish between helping people for immediate needs and giving things that help people to maintain a future capacity to live?
We don't sort of divide those things into two different categories, but one of the things about the effective altruism movement is it's concerned about people everywhere, and it's concerned about people not just right now, but in the future. Future people obviously can't. That's going to be very relevant when we talk about climate change, but it's relevant here too. So we are looking at both. So for example, living goods that Nick just talked about, or something like the Against Malaria Foundation, which distributes bed nets against malaria, helps people right here and now, helps children survive or people get over their illnesses. On the other hand, another organization called Giving Directly helps people to get small amounts of money from which they can start businesses and become sustainable in themselves in various ways. So we are certainly looking at the long-term implications of trying to get people out of poverty and get them to be able to sustain themselves for the long term. Okay,
thanks. So climate change was very much on the radar of the founders of Australian Ethical over 30 years ago. They ruled out investment from the get-go in the mining of coal and oil. Sadly, lack of action since that over that 30-year period means global warming does remain the single biggest threat we see to the well-being of people, animals, and the planet. Peter, how are you thinking about individual and collective responses to climate change?
I entirely agree that climate change is a huge shadow hanging over the progress that otherwise we've been making. If you look at things like the number of people in extreme poverty, the number of children dying before their 5th birthday, all of those are moving in the right direction. Extreme poverty has been falling over decades. Number of children surviving has been growing. But climate change threatens to undermine all of that. So it's a huge question. It is, I think, the great moral challenge of the 21st century. I think one of our recent prime ministers said that, but didn't do enough to meet that challenge. And we have to think what we can do about it. So I think it's a very difficult problem to solve. It's one that essentially is a giant prisoner's dilemma kind of problem. So a prisoner's dilemma is where it's in your interest, it's in the interest, let's say, of an individual prisoner to confess to a crime to get a lighter sentence and implicate others in the prison, but collectively they'll all do better if none of them confess. And this is a similar sort of situation where, you know, individually, at least for a short term, we might see it as rational to not take the action to benefit from the cheapest energy, or to continue to eat meat that involves high emissions. But collectively, we will all be better off if we switch to clean energy, if we dramatically reduce consumption of meat from ruminant animals, and take other steps to at least slow climate change. I don't think we can anymore talk about preventing climate change. Climate change is already upon us. What we can aim at doing is to prevent it becoming absolutely catastrophic. And that's what, back in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, 197 nations pledged to do, including, of course, Australia and the United States under Ronald Reagan, although recent, more Republican presidents obviously have not gone along with that. But they pledged to avoid what they call dangerous anthropogenic climate change. And we need to follow through with that. We need to follow through at every level. I think that if we ask what are our responsibilities as citizens, then we have dual responsibilities. We have the responsibility to be active citizens and to pressure our governments as far as we possibly can to treat this as a serious emergency issue. And in that respect, I greatly admire Greta Tunberg, the young Swedish activist who has brought that message to world leaders, done so in a very sincere and intense manner, accused them of destroying her future as a young person. And I think we need to reinforce that message at all generations. And it's not only the future of young people alive today, but of course, it's future generations who will live on this planet. And for that matter, it's also non-human animals. We'll be talking about them more specifically in a moment. But clearly, climate change is going to cause a huge wave of extinctions where animals cannot go somewhere else to maintain the kind of climate that they're in. In Australia, we could think, for example, about our alpine species. There are species that live only in the alpine areas where there's snow, and they need that to survive. They can't migrate higher up the mountains as they might be able to do in some countries when climate changes and it gets warmer, because we don't have high mountains. So that's one example of a whole ecosystem that is likely to become extinct. And of course, we're already seeing the coral reefs being severely damaged through climate change. That's a precious ecosystem that we have been blessed with having a remarkable Great Barrier Reef and other coral reefs. It's going to be very difficult to save them at all. I think we'll need very drastic action. So as citizens, we need to campaign about that and to try to make that an important political issue. We also need to set examples ourselves. A lot of people say, well, you know, what can I do? I'm just one person. It makes no difference what I do. But in fact, we are not only affecting the emissions that we ourselves put out, depending on how we live, what we drive, what we do, but we're also setting examples for others. And again, it's like what I was talking about in terms of changing the culture with regard to giving. We need to change the culture with regard to living as lightly on the planet as we can, and with doing things like putting solar panels on our roof, with trying to avoid driving where we can, with using public transport or walking or riding a bike, or if we are driving, using an electric vehicle or a hybrid, trying to fly less. All of those things, I think, are things that we should be thinking about doing. And maybe one blessing of this pandemic is that surely we've learned that we can now conduct lots of meetings like we're conducting this one over Zoom. And I'm hoping that businesses will learn this lesson, and they'll save themselves some money as well as reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by not flying people around the country or internationally to attend meetings that can be just as effectively held online. So I think those are all things that we need to think about. But of course, the role of investment is important too, and that's why it's great that Australian Ethical has taken this stance for a very long time. At Princeton, I've been supporting ethics efforts for Princeton to divest from the fossil fuels. Princeton has a sort of $20 billion endowment, and it's not divested from fossil fuels. We think it should. The university is doing some things. It's itself trying to become carbon neutral by 2040, I think, or 2045 was the date that was set. I've been on a committee looking at that. So those things are good, and we're doing research into. Princeton has a fusion laboratory, which would be a great clean energy if we ever got there. You know, some people think it will, never will. Some people think it might, and we have other research going on into clean energy. So there are good things that universities can do, but it's going to take a lot of effort, and sort of divesting from fossil fuels, making people see that they're unacceptable in the way that a lot of people now see that tobacco is unacceptable, or that the manufacture of drugs like OxyContin, which have caused such widespread addiction, is unacceptable. I think we need to see that about the fossil fuel industry as well.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, it's a tough one, which we struggle with a lot. So Q&A, please enter your questions on climate for Peter into the Q&A. Peter, sorry for this one without notice, but I don't know whether you did see the Jeff Bezos announcement and trying to make the link between the effective altruism and climate. He's pledged a big chunk of money. I forget the figure.
$10 billion he's pledged overall, but he hasn't, and he's made some gifts of 100 million each, I think, roughly to I think 5 of the big conservation organizations, Nature Conservancy or World Wildlife Fund or Environmental Defenders. And you know, that's good. I don't know that they're the most effective organizations. I'm not sure that that's really that he's really done his research and looked at how do you get the biggest marginal benefit from donating $100 million to an organization. You know, quite likely there's a lot of smaller organizations that 100 million or even much less than that might have had a bigger impact than some of these larger organizations. But he's still got a lot to give away, so I'm not giving up on him yet. I'm hoping that he will be thinking about various strategies that can help the environment and that can help on the climate change issue as well. And that is, by the way, just to pick up something that was mentioned, I think, by Nick, that is something that Life You Can Save is starting to look at. We haven't as yet recommended organizations trying to reduce climate change. We've been focusing on those that are directly helping people in extreme poverty, either, as I say, now or for the future. But we discussed this at our last board meeting, and we were all in agreement that climate change is going to have the biggest impacts on the poorest people in the world. They're the ones who are least able to defend themselves from it. They're the ones, for example, who might be peasant farmers dependent on rainfall. And if rainfall changes, if the monsoon, the Asian monsoon changes, or rainfalls change in sub-Saharan Africa, they're not going to be able to feed themselves. They're going to become climate refugees. So because of the poverty connection, we are going to start recommending what we regard as the most effective organizations doing something about climate change as well.
Yeah. I guess one of the things we find important to do is think about how, you know, activity across the economy and society needs to take climate change into account. It's not just energy. It's not even just transport. I mean, you've mentioned diet, and that's obviously critical in the way we look at things as well. But yeah, the buildings that we live in and work in, yeah, and have a massive carbon footprint. Are there, yeah, beyond those, or comment on those more if you'd like, beyond those, are there other areas of human economic activity, social activity that you think we need to sort of rethink about how we do them?
Yeah, let me say a little bit more about the meat aspect, which I did briefly touch upon. But a few years ago, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization said that the livestock industry is responsible for as much in the way of greenhouse gas emissions as the entire transport sector. I think about 17% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So after the production of stationary energy, of electricity, basically, the production of meat was the next largest factor. Now, there's some dispute over that, whether it's that or whether transport is slightly larger, but it is a big sector, and it is one that it's in our power to change. In this case, it is particularly ruminants, cattle, so beef, and also the dairy industry, and sheep, which of course we have a lot in Australia, that are the major producers because they produce methane as part of their digestion, and that's a very potent greenhouse gas. So that's certainly one other area that we should be looking at. Otherwise, I think we should also be supporting the idea of Australia being a major solar energy producer, and I think that's a perfectly feasible thing for us to do. We have a lot of sun, we have a lot of land that is of relatively low value for other economic uses. Of course, I support the preservation of a lot of Australia for biodiversity and wilderness, but I think we have possibilities, and that's certainly something that we should be pushing much harder.
Yeah, no, I think really exciting to think about that and the role that can play in producing hydrogen as a clean source of fuel for manufacturing industry, for export, for vehicles. So yeah, really interesting. Peter, sort of the term climate justice, I guess, conjures up a range of issues. But yeah, how do you think about the different responsibilities of countries like Australia versus developing countries' economies to take action? And should some countries have a bigger future emissions budget to reflect where they are in development?
Yes, so many years ago, a philosopher called Henry Shue suggested a distinction between luxury emissions and necessity, essential emissions. And I think that there is something in this. If countries need to produce energy in order to get their population out of extreme poverty, to feed them and find them jobs, then I think they're entitled to increase their emissions in ways that countries where a lot of the emissions, a large part of the emissions, are essentially luxuries, not essential for us to continue to live. Those are the ones where we could tighten our belts. And after all, these countries also typically have far lower per capita emissions, and that's another possible criterion for justice in emissions, is to say, look, the atmosphere belongs to everybody equally, and no one person has a greater right to put more pollutants into the atmosphere than anyone else when they're going to affect all of us. So you could say a just way to allocate the capacities of the atmosphere to absorb our greenhouse gases is to draw up a kind of a carbon budget. How many gigatons of carbon can we put into the atmosphere by, let's say, 2050 without producing more than 2 degrees or more than 1.5 if we're ambitious degrees of warming? You take that budget, then you divide it among the entire world's population equally, so 7.6 billion or whatever it is, and then you allocate it to countries in proportion to their population. And on that basis, Australians, for example, would be exceeding their per capita share by something like a factor of 4 or 5, whereas some of the poorest countries in the world would be nowhere near it. So Australia, the United States come out very much ahead. Europe comes out maybe 2 or 3 times their per capita shares. China comes out a little bit over their per capita share and going up quite rapidly. India comes out still under its per capita share. And the poorer countries of Africa, like I saw, I think on one estimate, Burkina Faso would take until 2087 to contribute its per capita share at present rates. So there's just vast discrepancies, and clearly those very poor countries, I think, are entitled to at least their per capita share, and we are being greedy and using far more than that.
Okay, well, it's almost time to move on, but there's a couple of things here I just want to mention. So there's a call to action for the Zylee Steggle climate bill, which is currently under consideration by a Senate committee, and they're inviting public submissions. So for those of you who don't know, that's a piece of legislation, draft legislation, to create a framework to get us to net zero by 2050 and provide the sort of policies that we're sadly lacking in this country to basically create a system, policies which encourage us to reduce emissions rather than carrying on business as usual. So get on the climate action website to support that bill. And the other one, Pete, I don't have a view on this, but worth passing on the sentiment, I think. So the suggestion, I think, here is that money's not the answer. We need more women in leadership positions. The Dalai Lama has apparently said that when every nation on the world has a female leader, wars will stop, and maybe we'll get climate action then. I don't know. Do you want to comment on that?
So I think there was an interesting article that I read about countries with women leaders and how they handled the coronavirus crisis. Obviously, New Zealand is an example close to us that has handled it well with a woman leader. Taiwan, I think, has a woman leader. There were several other examples. And this was a huge contrast with the United States, of course, in particular, and not that Australia is doing great either here. But there was something about women taking a longer term view. There have been psychological studies that women are more likely to take a long-term view. Also, maybe that they're less concerned to put their ego out there, and that somehow that relates to being closer to climate denialism, and to say, we don't have to worry about this, or they're just taking a short-term political view. So, I don't know. That's pretty speculative, but the United States seems to have got a little closer to having a woman leadership. It looks at least at having a woman vice president, and an extremely talented woman who I imagine would be, since Joe Biden has said that he'll only serve one term, who could be a very strong candidate for president in 2024.
Yep, some reason for hope. Okay, time to move on again. Animal welfare is our last topic. And I guess it's worth recognising that compared to issues like human rights and climate, harm to animals gets far less attention from most institutional investors. But for us, Australian ethical animal impacts has always been a key factor in how we assess ethical investments under our ethical charter. Last month, one of our ethics team, Amanda Richmond, was arranged and chaired a panel focused on animal welfare at the annual conference of the Responsible Investment Association in Australasia. So I think there is growing focus on this, and I guess the pandemic, draws attention to another aspect of impact that intensive animal agriculture potentially can have. Well, sorry, that's probably not a pandemic particular point given the origins of COVID, but more generally sort of issues around antimicrobial resistance and so on associated with intensive animal agriculture is sort of on the radar. Peter, you wrote the Bible of the animal rights movement, Animal Liberation, about 50 years ago. I think it was your first book, correct me if that's wrong. But in any case, very fitting to finish up with this topic today.
Yeah, thank you. It was actually my second book, because my first book was a thesis that I wrote as a graduate student at Oxford on civil disobedience, a little book called Democracy and Disobedience. But certainly Animal Liberation was the second and got a lot more attention. And it's, it's really interesting for me to think back now to how much has changed, but also in a way how much has not changed. What's changed is that I had never thought about the ethics of how we treat animals, and I was studying philosophy and specializing in ethics throughout my undergraduate years at Melbourne University. It wasn't that I wasn't interested in ethics. I was involved in the Early Abortion Law Reform Association. I was president of an organization against conscription for the Vietnam War. But these seem to be the issues. And I never thought about the treatment of animals as an issue until I was a graduate student at Oxford. So I was, say, 24 or something at this time, and happened to meet a Canadian graduate student who was a vegetarian. And I think he was the first vegetarian that I'd ever had a conversation with about why be a vegetarian. And that's inconceivable now, right? You can't imagine going through your whole undergraduate career without knowing and talking to vegetarians and that being an issue on the radar. But it just wasn't. And I had no idea that animals, even then, in 1970, were increasingly being taken indoors, off the fields, and crowded together by the thousands in big dim sheds in factory farms. So it was that conversation and that discovery about how the meat that I was eating was being produced, that led me to start to assess the moral status of animals. And why do we think that humans all have rights and are all equal in some sense, but animals are not? How do we defend that? I looked at ways of defending that and defending my own diet that I'd been used to all my life, and eventually decided I couldn't. That you couldn't justify the way we were treating animals, particularly in factory farms, but in general, that you couldn't justify this sort of sharp division between all humans having this special moral status and moral value, and no non-human animals having that. In fact, non-human animals basically being items of property, things for us to use in whatever way we like, as long as, I guess, we're not wantonly cruel to them. So that was still is perhaps with many people the mainstream view. If you see somebody beating a dog with a stick in the street, you'll call the police or try to stop them, but you won't ask questions about how the chicken in the supermarket was produced. And even if you do know how it was produced, that may not stop you eating it. So I think we do need to broaden our ethical circle, expand our ethical circles. I wrote, as you mentioned, a book on that, to include essentially all sentient beings, all beings who can feel pain. Their pain matters, and that's something that it's wrong to ignore. And that's why I'm very pleased that Australian Ethical has always taken animal welfare as one of its ethical pillars. Given that I've got limited time, I want to just focus on factory farming, because in terms of the numbers, this is where the vast amount of the suffering we inflict on animals is. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says that 74 billion animals are raised for food worldwide each year, and the great majority of them are factory farmed. They're indoors. And although, as I said, attitudes and awareness of animal issues has improved because of the greater prosperity of China and East Asia generally, meat consumption has also increased globally, even if not in all countries. So this is where, and in terms of the lives they lead, these animals' lives, I think, are quite miserable. Ruth Harrison, who was the author of the first book I ever saw on factory farming, the only book that existed on factory farming in 1970, has a line. She says, "Cruelty is acknowledged only where profitability ceases." So basically, as long as it doesn't interfere in your profits, corporate agriculture doesn't acknowledge cruelty. And yet it's compatible with a vast amount of cruelty, because what matters is the profitability of the entire enterprise, not the well-being of each animal. So if you, for example, if you have hens in cages, laying hens, and you put more hens in the cage, so many more that more of your hens die, that may not mean that this is not profitable, because you've got more hens in cages and therefore you might have more eggs, and the cost of the hens is marginal to the cost of the enterprise as a whole. So, so that's the way agribusiness works, and I think it's got no ethical basis at all for regarding animals in that way. But in addition, there are other factors. I've talked about animal agriculture and climate change already, so that's an additional reason for avoiding meat and dairy in particular that I wasn't aware of when I wrote Animal Liberation first. And you mentioned the pandemics, and I think there is some basis for that. It's true that this particular pandemic seems to have come to us through eating consumption of wild animals, through the horrible wet market, so-called, of Wuhan, where wild animals are kept alive in cages and crammed together, and then a customer points to one and says, "I'll have that one," and it's had its throat cut and bled out on the spot. So it's a completely unhygienic as well as very cruel situation. But if we go back to the previous pandemic, it was the 2009 swine flu pandemic. We don't compare that with what's going on now, because most of the deaths occurred in outside affluent nations. But there were quite a lot of deaths. There were maybe 500,000 deaths on some estimates. So not we long passed that figure globally, but it came out of factory farms for pigs in probably in North Carolina. And then we had avian flu epidemics. None of them fortunately became a pandemic, that came out of chicken production. And a lot of scientists who've looked at factory farming say, if you really wanted to produce a breeding ground for new viruses, you would take thousands of animals, put them inside a shed, crowd them so that their immune systems are under a lot of pressure, and then have them interacting with humans so that the viruses could jump across to humans. And that's what we're doing. So if we do want to reduce the risks of further pandemics, getting rid of factory farms would definitely be a major factor. You also mentioned the microbiotic thing. This is different from viruses. This is the use of antibiotics to control low-level infections in crowded, stressed, immune-depressed animals, and that's pretty standard in factory farms, and that breeds antibiotic resistance in bacteria, and we've already had a lot of problems with that, and no doubt we'll have more. So there are many good reasons, I think, for trying to stop factory farming, for not investing in it, obviously, for boycotting its products, and trying to spread the word about this very major source of animal suffering that doesn't do any good for the climate or for human health. And let me also mention, in case some of you are thinking, well, but don't we need to feed a growing population? It's actually, many years ago, Francis Moore Lappé said, this kind of farming that feeds grain or soybeans to animals is actually a protein factory in reverse, because you start out with a large quantity of food and a large quantity of protein, particularly if you're feeding soybeans, and you funnel it through the animals, which burn up a lot of the food value just to keep their bodies warm and to move around, and to develop parts of their bodies that we don't eat, like bones or some internal organs. And then you get a smaller amount of food value and protein out at the end. So in terms of land use and putting pressure on the planet, factory farming is, again, a very negative thing.
Okay, so last call, last chance for questions for Peter. I mean, I just want to, echo the point about the disconnect between profit and animal welfare. I mean, it's at once so obvious, but it still gets trotted out time and time again as being a reason why we would look after animal welfare in the Department of Agriculture. So we and many others have been calling for a separate department office of animal welfare, and the response is often, well, good, profitable agriculture is perfectly aligned with animal well-being, but clearly that the two come apart in the sort of circumstances you're indicated, that yeah, you can contemplate much lower animal well-being and higher animal mortality and still increase your profits. So it's really something at a consumption level, but also at a policy level and governance level that needs to be addressed. That yeah, this is a intrinsically important thing that needs to be independently protected, and that's yeah, certainly the way we apply our ethical charter. So some questions have come in. Peter, what do you think about lab-grown meat and also obviously different plant-based meat?
Yes, I'm in favour of both of those, especially if they can compete not only in terms of taste and the kind of chewiness or mouthfeel, as people in the industry call it, but also on price. So lab-grown meat, which is not going to be, I think, the way it's marketed. It might be called cultured meat or cellular meat, perhaps. Some people are trying to call it clean meat, which is nice, but I don't know whether they'll get away with that. Would not involve any whole animal. It would be just meat cells cultured. And some studies suggest that it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from meat production by 97%. So it would be great for the planet as well as great for animals. We haven't, there have been samples produced, but we certainly haven't yet got it to market. Plant-based meats are now on the market. I've tried the so-called Impossible Burger. I haven't eaten meat burgers for a very long time, but people who do still eat meat say that it's at least as good as a standard beef burger. But it's at the moment it's more expensive than a standard beef burger. So I think we need to get more of this onto the market, and we need to produce it at lower prices. And I'm hopeful that then it will dramatically reduce the market for meat from animals, and the same thing could happen to dairy products. And that would clearly be a good thing, especially, as I say, with the huge growth in meat production in China. If we could find cultured ways or plant-based ways of producing the products that people want that are economically competitive and perhaps safer because they don't carry salmonella or other bacteria that meat does carry, that would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Peter, I mean, another sort of response to arguments for plant-based diets is still this sort of skepticism about the capacity for suffering of animals, which seems, strange at one level, but it does come up. I mean, are there good, and I guess it also comes up in terms of when we have, poultry which is bred in a certain way to be more sedentary and obviously to grow more quickly. Are you aware of research around animal wellbeing to help us understand more, what makes a good life, or what might make a good life for farm animals? Or, I suspect the answer will be, more evidence that this is not a good life. But yeah, is there work being done on that?
Yes, there's quite a lot. There are a couple of big animal welfare research centres in Europe, one associated with Bristol University, with the veterinary school. There's another one in the Netherlands, and there are some others in other European countries. So one of the things you mentioned, breeding chickens to grow very fast, which has happened. The average chicken in the supermarket now was killed at about 6 weeks of age, about 42 days. And they're quite large, obviously. So they've been bred to grow much faster. And research from Professor John Webster at the Bristol Centre shows that the result of this is that their immature leg bones often don't support their weight properly. And so you've got this very heavy bird with basically a baby bird's leg bones. And in some cases, the legs just collapse and the bird can't move anymore. And in factory farms, basically, that bird will die of dehydration or starvation if it doesn't happen to happen near food or water, because nobody walks through these sheds to monitor the bird's health or take them to a vet or anything like that. It's just wouldn't pay. But when that doesn't happen, according to Professor Webster, the birds are actually in pain from standing on these weak bones for the last 2 weeks of their lives when they're starting to get heavy. He likens it to somebody with arthritis being forced to stand all day. And they can't really sit down on they're on this kind of litter, straw, but the litter is full of their droppings. And that produces a kind of a acidic reaction with the moisture in the air. So actually, if they try and sit down on this for a long time, they get acid burns on their hocks. So they're not going to do that either. So I think there's a lot of ways in which it's clear that factory farming thwarts the interests of birds. And they still have these interests. It's really interesting to see. You take an egg-laying hen, for example, who spent a year in a cage, has never been outside, has never been on grass. When she was a chick, before she got in the cage, she was still indoors. And mostly after a year or so, when their rate of laying drops off, they're taken to be slaughtered. But suppose you buy one. Some of the places will sell you one if you want it. So you buy one and you put it out and on grass in a pasture. Immediately, that bird will start to run around, chase insects, scratch in the dirt, dust bathe, thing that hens do to fluff up dust under their wings. And when she's ready to lay an egg, she'll look for a sheltered spot, maybe try to get some grass or straw to build a kind of a nest. Although she's been living on wire all of her life, she's never had grass or anything to build a nest. So those instincts are still there. They haven't been bred out of the birds, despite all of this intensive breeding for more laying.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close to time, so throwing things open. Any question? We're going to allow anything on any topic at this point for Peter. If you have some investment related questions, we've actually got our CIO on the line, David Macri. So yeah, I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. I don't know, one from me, and I don't know, it could be a good note to end on or not. Yeah, how do you feel what's looking ahead 20 years, Peter? Will our attitude to eating animals or animals raised in certain ways fundamentally change? Is there, they're ultimately voiceless. Is that going to be the barrier that stops us paying better attention to their well-being?
I think that our attitudes could change, and I think for our attitudes to change, we will need to see some of these alternatives, either plant-based or cultured meat alternatives, becoming more widespread. I think the problem is that people who have grown up all their lives eating meat have a kind of a vested interest. They have an inherent bias in discounting the suffering of animals and the other environmental effects of factory farming. So for attitudes to change, I think we need to get them more comfortable with alternatives, get them to see that they can eat well without committing themselves to eating meat. And then we could get a bigger shift going in terms of people's attitudes. And I'm hoping that within 20 years, that will have happened.
Yeah, well, certainly share that hope. Okay, we are at time. So yeah, just Peter, I want to thank you, enormously for sharing your time with us. It's been, not surprisingly, extremely thought-provoking and action-provoking, I hope. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, Stuart, and thanks to all of you there listening. I hope I've given you something to think about, and look forward to having further conversations with people on these topics.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.